Ado, it is my privilege to introduce our presenters for today's session. Both of them are colleagues of mine at the Colorado State Library. We have Beth Christ, who is the Youth Services Coordinator at the Colorado State Library, and Jean Marie Heilig, who is the Fiscal Officer. So I am going to turn it over to you guys.
Thank you very much, Christine. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. There's a vast body of research that shows that the hiring process is very biased and unfair, and unconscious racism, ageism, and sexism really play a big role in who gets hired within our organizations. But there are steps that we can all take to recognize and reduce some of these biases. When Beth and I first started discussing doing this training, we had just come off a year of doing implicit bias training with libraries throughout the country, actually. We trained over, I think it was 1,000 librarians on unconscious bias. But the one thing that kept coming up was that people were interested in how these biases enter into our hiring processes. So, because there seemed to be a real need for that kind of training, we put together this presentation. Um, at the time, we didn't realize really how timely this presentation was, especially right now um, with the protests that are going on in our cities today and the discussions that are being had over the situation the unfortunate situation that happened with George Floyd. I know that it's left me with a lot of different emotions. I've been brought to tears. I've done a lot of soul searching and I've done a lot of thinking. And, the first thing that I always ask myself is, what can I do? And I was really almost at a loss as far as, what can I do that'll really make a difference? But I'm a firm believer that the best way to institute change is through education. And I think that it says a lot that all of you are joining us today, because the more we can learn about our biases and about ourselves, um, the easier it will be for us to possibly help move that needle, to help formulate some of that change going on in our world. So I applaud you all for joining us. And with that, let's go ahead and continue on. I love this quote: if you have a brain, you're biased. The first step to making better decisions is to accept this one simple idea that we all have biases. Bias is very automatic and conscious, and it really impacts our every decision that we make. It's a natural process, and actually not what you're biased about, but that you have these biases. If you think about it, do you sometimes find yourself reflexively laughing at an offensive joke? Or thinking maybe when you see an overweight person in a restaurant eating a dessert, thinking, maybe they shouldn't be doing that? Or, do you treat males differently from females? Do you adjust your posture or your walking speed when you walk past a young male of a different race, late at night? All of these things are, thoughts that we may have that we're not totally consciously aware of. And please excuse the barking dog in the background. It never fails. Let's talk a little bit about, what exactly is a bias? Well, it's an inclination or a prejudice for or against one person or group, whether it's intentional or unintentional. It's the attitudes and stereotypes that really affect our decisions. It can stymie diversity, recruiting, promotion, and our retention efforts. There's two types of biases. And the first one is explicit bias. And that is the attitudes and beliefs that we have about a person or a group on a very conscious level. It's related behaviors that are conducted very much with intent. We know that we have maybe a prejudice about something, or we're biased about something. There's no doubt about it. But with implicit biases, it's very different. Those are the biases that result from the tendency to process information based on unconscious associations and feelings, even when these are kind of contrary to one's conscious or declared beliefs. We may not think that we have a bias towards something, but subconsciously, sometimes these biases may come out. There's a test that we recommend people always take. It's the Harvard Implicit Bias Test. And it's a wonderful, you can just Google that and you'll get the URL for it. But it's a wonderful way to help identify some of your implicit biases. And this test is very rigorously vetted. It was done by some major Ivy League universities in the country, and it's constantly changing and being updated. So I very highly recommend that everybody take. They got several tests that you can take. They don't take long, but I think they might offer you some insights on things that you weren't quite aware of. So if we go to the next slide, where do our biases come from? And what the researchers have found is there's a couple of different ways that they can kind of be ingrained in our psyche. One is through our direct experiences, and those are experiences with other people, events, situations. So if you think about the interactions that you had with your parents, with your family, maybe it was the neighborhood that you grew up in, or it could be, anything where you have, maybe if your parents had prejudices or biases, when you're very young, you're very, what's the word, malleable, where you're like a sponge, you soak everything in. And a lot of these biases do come from us very early on in our existence. Now, the vicarious experiences are those that are relayed to us through other people's stories, books, movies. Like right now, it's really interesting. Some of the articles I've been reading about the way TV portrays law enforcement and some of the more popular sitcoms and not even the sitcoms, but even the dramas, the weekly dramas. That maybe we need to start thinking about the way we're portraying law enforcement in these aspects to really portray them, this group of people the way real life is. So there's a lot of things that are being brought up, about our vicarious experiences. Let's look at I always like to make sure that I have some data that backs up, some of the things that I talk about. And especially with the library workforce, I was able to find, actually, Beth and I found some information on statistics about how this whole topic is affecting the library workforce. Just a few things to keep in mind. The biggest reason companies will avoid hiring for diversity, 41% say that they're too busy. Even though the stats show that racially diverse teams always outperform non-diverse teams. Not always, but 35% of the time they outperform. So to say that they're too busy is really kind of a poor excuse. Applicants with disabilities receive 26% fewer expressions of interest from potential employers. So, what are we supposed to do, with this? And that's what Beth and I are going to be talking quite a bit about. Or what are some of the things that we can do up front with our hiring processes to make sure that these things aren't happening? So let's just look at some library effects, and I'll do this real quickly because you can read the slides yourselves. But and Beth said this. Let's address the elephant in the room. Basically, in our profession, it's mostly females, 79%, and males, 21%. So, that's a shift in thinking, I think, that we need to have some conversations about, why is this happening? And actually, we could do a whole nother webinar on trying to pull apart some of these statistics and, asking about why or how. But, we're also, there's a lot of us white females out there, myself included. It's 77% is white or non-Hispanic, whereas only 6.8% are Black, Hispanic 8.6%, Asian Pacific 4.6, Asian American and Pacific Islander is 4.6%. So, these percentages are very low, but they are reality within our worlds. And then, of course, there's the earnings potential, and a lot of this is reflected in other types of institutions as well, working environments where, oftentimes women tend to be underpaid compared to men, and so on and so forth. So it just kind of gives us a little bit of information there as we start. Now, Christine's going to pull up a chat box. And in that chat box, I'd love for you all to join in and let me know what your feelings are on what biases do you think can affect the hiring process. So if you'll just go ahead and type in your responses there in the center, I'd love it. Age, absolutely age. Ability, geographic location, we'll talk about that. Race, yes. Disabilities, family situations. If there's, yes, children or lack of, yes. Oftentimes maybe decisions will be made if it's a young female with children, they may not want to hire her because what if she has another child soon after she starts? Access of transportation. You guys are coming up with some great ones. These are wonderful.
And Jean, in the other chat box, there's a couple people that have put some things like attire and maybe how people talk. Teeth. I had never thought of teeth,
yes.
But probably, if your teeth are crooked or, language skills. Yeah. So this is it's kind of intense how many different things could potentially affect the.
Absolutely. This is wonderful. Religion, yes.
The lack of affect and eye contact, that's really a good one, which could get.
And favoritism, which I think also plays into bias because we frequently tend to favor people who are like us. And facial decorations and tattoos.
This is wonderful. Thank you all so very much. As you can see, it's endless. It really is endless as far as all of the things that may affect the hiring process, some that we're aware of and some that we're not aware of. So let's go ahead and go forward, Christine.
And Jean, just very quickly, I wanted to draw attention to a comment that Lisa made in the chat box, and she is thanking us for doing the webinar today, but she wanted to draw attention to at the beginning of the session when we were talking about the unfortunate situation with George Floyd and reminding us to call things for what they are and that he was murdered. So I just wanted to, as I am continuing to learn about this, I wanted to honor the fact that she brought that up in chat and thank her for that as we move forward.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out. I do appreciate that as well. And agreed. Now, what I want to do is talk about some of the unconscious behaviors that may impact the hiring process. Now, we'll talk about different bias types, of which, depending on where you read, some say there's about 35 identified biases. Others will say there are hundreds of them. And I think when you look at our last chat, there's definitely hundreds of them. But we're just going to take the top ones. And the first one we're going to start with is just watching a quick little video on gender bias. Okay, Christine? I think maybe we've lost Christine. So what I want you to do
sorry,
is
I got it.
You got okay.
Sorry. Yes, sorry, I was answering a question. So we're going to watch a very short video, and it is hyperlinked in your screen. I will also put a link in the chat chat. With Adobe Connect, they get kind of fussy about how we watch videos in the software itself in respect for copyright. So what I want everybody to do is, if you're able to click on the link, watch the video, and then come back, and in the upper kind of middle of the screen you should see a guy with his hand up, and I want you to raise your hands when you are back from watching the video if you can. And I'll put the Okay, and I am seeing quite a few hands raised, and my sincere apologies to those who are attending on mobile devices. I will need to do a little bit of research about the best way to do video stuff on mobile devices. So if you were not able to view the videos now, they are linked on the slides, which I will post on the CSL in Session website after the session. So once again, accept my apologies. And I think we have most people are back. Just a couple more people, so maybe another 30 seconds, Jean.
That's fine. Thank you, Christine. Okay, I think I'll go ahead and go on since most of you are back. This video is a little bit older, but I think it really does a good job of looking at how biases. Now, I think subconsciously we would think, oh, well, men may have a bias against women, but we don't really think about women being biased about other women too. So I kind of like this video because it brings out these things. It's kind of like an aha moment, that we need to think about a little bit. So great. I'm glad looks like you're all back. So let's go ahead and go forward. Let's talk about confirmation bias. Everyone is really quick to pass judgment, and we make snap decisions based on perceived truths and then spend the rest of the time subconsciously or not trying to justify what our bias is. This is when we ask kind of irrelevant questions trying to elicit answers that may support our initial assumption about the candidate. We do this because we want to believe that we're right about our instincts about this person and that our assessment of the candidate is correct. In fact, 60% of interviewers will make a decision based on a candidate's suitability within 15 minutes of meeting them. Wow. Some will have it done even before the interview happens. Something to keep in mind. Another type of bias is beauty bias. And this is the view that we tend to think that the most handsome individual will be the most successful, but it can also play out in terms of other physical attributes a person may have. For example, while 60% of the CEOs in the US are over 6 feet tall, and mostly men, they're only 15% of the total population is over 6 feet tall. So it's very disproportionate. And while 36% of US CEOs are over 6.22 feet, only 4% of the US population is that tall. So again, this shows that some biases in terms of how we perceive a CEO should look like, may come out this way. In recruitment, it's common that recruiters will look to fill a role with someone who shares similar physical attributes to the person who held that role previously, or who they believe looks like the kind of person who should have that role based on their own preconceived biases. Let's take a look at another one, which is called the halo effect. And that's the one where you say to yourself, there's one thing I like about you. So of course there must be other things that are equally as good. It's when we see one great thing about a person and we let the halo glow of that significant thing affect our opinions and everything else about that person. It's, um, we're in awe of them due to only one particular thing. Could be that, our very first impression of them was great, and so therefore everything else must be great as well. And the second one is called the horns effect, which is the opposite. It's when something bad about the candidate negatively grabs our attention and we really can't move beyond that. And we kind of let it cloud our judgment. And more often than not, it impacts our hiring decision because we believe that if the candidate is bad at A, then they'll also be bad at, B and C. For example, during the interview, if someone speaks very slowly, we may have a preconceived bias. The people who speak this way may not be as intelligent as other people. The next one is called leniency bias. And this occurs when applicants might be rated too high because of your own personal context. Sometimes interviewers might rate an applicant leniently because they feel that it might reflect unfavorably or on themselves, or it might affect their relationship with the person being rated. It's very similar where a panel is reluctant to give clearly high or low ratings to the interviewee so as to avoid any hint of bias towards any particular gender or ethnic group, and so tend to rate everyone in the middle, irrespective of their suitability for the job. Now, the next one here is called strictness or stringent bias, and it's the opposite of leniency bias. This is where a particular interviewer might be rated too negatively because of the interviewer's own context or their negative view of certain personality traits. Then we have the compare and contrast effect. This is our brains use comparisons to place things and people into context. In an interview situation, if a candidate seems better than the ones before them, then you're more likely to rate them much higher than they normally would be in a different context. Or if the previous candidate was particularly good, then the one following would not appear as suitable for the position. It can be reflected in comparing resumes instead of having each one of them stand on their own. Similarity bias or affinity bias. And this is the one where it's probably one of the most common biases we have. It's having a more favorable opinion of someone like us. In hiring, it often means referring or selecting a candidate who shares our same race or gender, or who went to the same school, speaks the same language, or maybe reminds us of our younger selves. It's what you really want to do to help counteract this is to spend time reading and learning about the experiences of underrepresented communities at work. And we have the very last one, which is that we'll talk about, is conformity bias. And that's where it relates to bias caused by group peer pressure. I don't know if you're familiar with the business term groupthink. It's how we think about how this would play out during an interview panel. If an individual feels that the majority of the group is leaning towards or away from a certain candidate, um, then if the other individual who may think a little bit differently, they tend to go along with the flow just because it's easier than to try to raise any kind of just argument against this person. You know, if they're the lone wolf, then they're more likely to just kind of go with the flow and go with what everybody else is saying. Now, with that, I'm going to turn this over to Beth.
Okay, now we're going to work through the whole hiring process to look at how each stage of this we can fight our bias. So we're going to go through recruitment, application, and resume review, interviews, and the actual selection process. And we'll start here with recruitment. And I should say before we get started, I am a youth services librarian. And so a lot of the examples I'm going to be using are in this section are related to youth services, but please think about what that would look like, that particular example would look like for positions that you're hiring for. So here in recruitment, the really first phase of this is for each position that you have open, really honestly assess the skills, education, and knowledge needed for that position. Does the position really require a library degree or library experience, or maybe even a bachelor's degree? And to do this, really focus on the most critical skills and knowledge needed, and also consider what can be learned on the job. So this allows you to cast the widest net possible for someone who would be suitable for this position. And let's take a look at job description. So taking that to the next step, really, again, focusing on the essential skills and outcomes over particular experience and education. For instance, again, I'm going to go to my youth services background here. For a position in children's department, there are many paths to arriving at the skill of group management of young children and knowledge of children's learning development. For instance, perhaps a child care provider or preschool teacher could do the job perfectly well without having any prior library experience or MLIS. If you really do want to call out certain desired skills or education, you can sometimes soften the message with language like familiarity with or bonus points for, or if you have a combination of these skills and education. Whenever you include jargon or abbreviation in a job description, that can include anyone coming from outside the library field, and also can focus on people just with a certain educational background. And the last bullet, the using inclusive and neutral language, is trickier, so we're going to spend a little more time on that one. There are many biases that can show up in job descriptions in just the wording, and this can be subtle, but really critical. So some words that often show up in job descriptions can be age-coded. For instance, words like fresh, digital native, energetic can attract young candidates and may discourage older workers from applying. Likewise, including words like mature and highly experienced might discourage those younger workers. A job description that emphasizes excellent English language skills may discourage a really excellent candidate who speaks English as a second language from applying. And then you lose an amazing employee that way. There are numerous words that can discourage a highly qualified candidate with a disability for applying for a position. Replacing a requirement to speak with communicate, and replacing a requirement that talks about seeing with identifying or assessing. and replacing walk with traverse are more neutral words and are more inclusive. You can also really scour your job descriptions for requirements that are no longer really current. They may have been in the past, but now they may not be needed at all and may be discriminatory. For instance, if you talk about you need to type a certain number of words per minute, when today a candidate could really do that input with their voice. And needing to read a certain tiny font when nearly all text these days can be enlarged with today's technology. So some of those things are totally inadvertent, but they're things that we kind of copy and paste from job descriptions in the past, but they're really not needed anymore, and they really can be discriminatory. So really scour those out. And lastly on the slide, using he and she and his or hers in job descriptions may possibly make your library appear unfriendly to LGBTQ candidates. And replacing those words with they and them can make your job descriptions also more inclusive. And we're going to look more closely at gender bias in job descriptions. This is just one example. There's a lot of research that shows that the words in the left column and others like active and dominate appeal more to male candidates, while those in the right column and others like commit and dependable are more likely to attract female candidates. And this is so important because research shows that women are unlikely to apply for a position unless they meet 100% of the requirements, while men will apply if they meet 60% of the requirements. ZipRecruiter has found that cutting gender bias terms can increase the number of applicants by 42%. And there are free services like Gender Decoder for job ads and Unbiasify, and they're both in your handout, and you can use those to scour your job ad to look for these particular biased words. And Bryce, I like your comment. Yeah, exactly. If you have a requirement like can lift 25 pounds, and that's hardly ever necessary, take it out. Yeah, that's great. That could really discourage someone unable to do that from applying. Thank you for pointing that one out. Great example. And we have an activity here which is a little challenging to do on a webinar, but there is a handout that is available here that you can take and print out and do. And what it is it's a job description that we created that is full of these coded words. And so the job description, you could print it out, and there are questions, guiding questions, like underline all of the coded words. Rewrite the job description to remove the biased words and phrases, and rewrite the required minimum qualifications to reflect what's really essential to fulfill the job duties. And so we encourage you, instead of really doing it here, which is a bit of a challenge, to go ahead and print out that we have sort of lost the file pod here. I'm not quite sure where that went. But anyway, we do have a handout available where you can just print that out. And it might be a great activity for you to do with your team. Oh, there it is. Okay. So this is the bias in hiring job description. That second file there in the file pod, right above the chat pod. So you can click on that file and download it, and then you might want to do that with your team while the next time you're posting a job, and just go through it and see what it brings up for you. See if you find some coded words and can substitute them with words that are less biased. So Nancy asks if you could send a link. Yes. So I think Christine is going to take care of that. But we do hope you find that job description activity to be useful. I find it very thought-provoking. So we'll go on. So the next phase of your job application process is to post the job. And for this, it's great if you advertise, of course, within your usual traditional library job outlets, but also beyond those. And what does that look like? Well, you could ask community partners to advertise your openings. The logos here shown at the bottom of the slide are some examples of organizations you could ask to share these opportunities. And this will help you cast a much wider net than looking solely in the traditional library field. And it's great if you can provide a contact to make the application process as seamless and equitable as possible. So to name a contact in the job posting who can help potential applicants get through the job application process, which sometimes can be confusing if you have a city or university. Sometimes those application processes can be rather challenging. So to have one person that people can contact through the whole process is great. And then providing as long an application process as possible is really critical too. That can make it most equitable for as many candidates as possible to be able to apply. Some may have trouble getting to internet access to apply for the job online. They may have to use their local public library, for instance, and they may not be able to get there in open hours and things like that that make that it can provide real barriers to people from applying. So to provide as long a period as possible will make it the most equitable process. And then we have another video for you to watch. So we're going to go through the same process here, and I know some of you had trouble before, but we'll try it again. Christine, do you want to talk through that again?
Yes, so we will do just like you did before. You can click on the link. I'm also putting it in the chat. Once again, my apologies to those who are on mobile devices. Once again, a short video that will be available on the slide, and we'll just have you guys raise your hands when you get. And we're seeing hands raised. About half of us are back. And we are still here, Mary. We're just waiting for people to finish up the video, so thanks for checking in. Maybe about another 30 seconds or so.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. I think we'll go ahead and go back. Okay, so now we've been through the actual writing of the job position and where we can post the position. Now those applications and resumes are coming in. So what are some of the next steps that we can do? And I'd like to start it off with just a short little video because I know sometimes it gets kind of boring just listening to us talk at you. And I thought that video was a pretty good one. Let's talk about going blind in the application and resume review process. Sometimes you need to level the playing field by ensuring that you're focused on your candidate's specific qualifications and talents and not surface demographic characteristics. There are software programs that can blind the process and be useful, but you have to remember that computer algorithms are only as good as the data they are trained on, and they can pick up hidden biases within these data sets. But the thing also with these is that the data and information that's going into the software program is being put in by humans and people who have unconscious biases. So sometimes they're not being, these algorithms aren't working at 100%. So you kind of, have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt in doing that. Going blind can also be really important to remove names off of the application or the resume. Perhaps you have somebody that goes in beforehand that's not a part of the hiring process and redacts that information. And because, names very often can indicate a person's race or ethnicity. The first two sets of names may not get the same number of callbacks as the third set. And here again, software programs may be able to, redact some of this information or change it, or just, simply a person doing that for you before you actually start reviewing the resume. So keep this in mind because this is in fact, I think I quoted a stat earlier about what a difference names can make. Another thing is that, resumes attach a place or applications attach a place to a person, and addresses indirectly tell employers something about the applicant's neighbors, their commute, their income level, and perhaps their preferences for neighborhood amenities. Applicants who live 5 to 6 miles further from the job received about 1/3 fewer callbacks. And the size of the penalty is similar to the penalty for signaling race with a black indicating name. Fascinating. I'm just very thankful that my job wasn't based on how far away I live because I have a 25-mile commute every day, but I make it. The next area that you could possibly go blind is, in universities. Where did somebody go to school? Do you have more of a bias towards them as being a good candidate because they graduated from the same program you did? Or what about those people who graduated from colleges that are no longer in existence? Does that give you a kind of, does that make you think that maybe their education isn't as worthy or isn't as good as somebody from an established university? Keep that in mind. This actually makes me laugh, but it's so important. No one likes to think of a hiring manager excluding them because they just don't like their profile picture. And you know as well as I do that one of the first things you're going to do when you get an application, you're probably going to go to their social media accounts to see what they're doing, to see what they're talking about, to see what they look like. And, it's you really need to be careful about doing this type of thing because, white job seekers received an average of 30%, 36% more callbacks than Black applicants and 24% more than Latinx. Obese candidates were perceived as less capable. Younger candidates received 3 to 4 times as many callbacks as an older one. So, what you really need is a blind, systematic process for reviewing applications or resumes that'll help you to improve your chance of including the most relevant candidates in your interview pool, including, uncovering some hidden gems. You're probably wondering what's the deal with all the dogs up here? Well, this is LinkedIn. There is a gentleman, he's the director of research and development at TED and from TED Talks. And he needed a way to review candidates without the effects of unconscious bias entering in. So he developed, it's a plugin that you can use on your Chrome browser. It's a Chrome browser extension. Then it automatically turns people's faces into dogs. So when you go in, if you've got this plugin enabled, if you go in and you pull up somebody's LinkedIn profile, their picture is replaced with one of a dog. Now you say, well, but what happens if a Rottweiler shows up? Or, if a Doberman Pinscher, are people going to have prejudices about those kinds of dogs? Absolutely, they will. So what they've done is every time you click to a different place within the LinkedIn profile, the picture changes. So, one picture you may have a Chihuahua and the next one you may have a German Shepherd. So it's kind of a random assortment, but what it does is it pretty much prevents you from seeing who that actual applicant is. It's a pretty cool thing to do, actually. Okay, Beth, let's turn it over to you. Scheduling interviews.
Yeah, so continuing on with the interview process, or the whole job application process, the next step is scheduling interviews. And offering as many interview time options as possible makes the process more equitable because candidates may have a full-time job or more than one job, and it may be really hard for them to get time off. They also may care for children or parents or other dependents, and they may need a lot of flexibility. Offering weekend or evening interviews is, if possible, is great, especially considering the scheduling of the actual position. If you're hiring for a weekend position, that may be the only time that candidates can make it to an interview. Same with offering remote interview or phone interview options. That also makes it more equitable. And similar to the application process, providing one contact for candidates to go through the interview process is really great. They just have one person they can contact. It makes it much easier. And communicating the hiring process with each candidate, both verbally and in writing, is really important. It just gives, again, it just makes it more equitable. And then when selecting your interview panel, ask 3 to 4 people to be on the panel because more than that can be really intimidating to some people. The panel should represent diverse backgrounds, and if you don't have the diversity on your staff, consider asking a community partner to be on the panel to bring in some diversity. Just be really upfront with everyone in the panel ahead of time, gather them together, say, acknowledge that everyone on the panel, including you, have biases, and we all need to be aware of them throughout the process. And if you can be upfront with that, and to keep it front of mind for all of the panelists throughout the whole process, just keep this in mind, be aware. We all have biases. And then if you can avoid discussing the candidates between interviews, that's ideal. That can get away from that conformity bias that Jean mentioned earlier. Standardizing the interviews as much as possible is great to keep it consistent. Ask each applicant the same questions. Create a rubric for scoring each candidate. Again, that will keep this equitable and it will reduce your biases creeping in. Do include likability on the rubric. This is a little controversial as that can get into bias, but that's good. You're actually addressing it. You say, well, I really like this person, and then you can address why. Why is it that you like this person? And how important is the likability for each panelist, and discuss it. And definitely have each panelist rate candidates separately before discussing as a group, again, to get away from that conformity bias. Biases can be embedded in interview questions. You may expect a certain approach to a conflict or anticipating that one does want to move up the ladder, or expecting certain characteristics such as assertiveness, or you may even be looking for a word or phrase in an answer, and all of these can be biased against certain cultural or linguistic groups or genders. It's great if you can focus on asking specific and behavioral questions. Ask for examples of a time when, and then the question that you want to get at. Definitely focus on skills and knowledge over any specific experience in education. And questions really need to be clear and concise and avoid jargon and abbreviations. And skills tests are great. Again, that really focuses on what candidates can do and focuses less on their education and experience. And again, my background will show here, but if it's a children's position, maybe ask them to provide your interview panel with a story time. That is an exact example of what they will be doing. We're running short on time, so I'm going to kind of speed this up here. During each interview, it's great if you can let the candidates initiate physical greetings, and that's especially important now during coronavirus, but just anytime, because there are a lot of different cultural implications to shaking hands, for instance. Perhaps that is not comfortable for your candidates, so let them initiate that first physical greeting. Provide information ahead of time, let them know what to expect. And then definitely be aware of your own body language and tone. And be sure it's consistent with all of the candidates. And then after the interviews, immediately conduct or convene your panel and discuss the possibility of bias. Again, bring it up front and center. And gather and review the rubrics and check for bias again. And I'm just going to quickly explain the flip it to test it test. So when you're discussing candidates, you can mentally flip who you're talking about to test your assumptions. I'll give you some examples and you'll get a much better idea of this. Imagine you're considering hiring a woman on your team who has young kids at home. The job is going to require a lot of travel, and you wonder if she'd be able to make all the needed trips. Flip that scenario to test it. Would you wonder that if the employee was a man? For another example, maybe you have an older candidate and wonder if she can work well in an open workplace that's often loud and full of distractions. And now flip that. Would you ask the same question of a recent college graduate? So I think that's really important and can really flesh out some bias. And with that, we're just about out of time. So we're going to, we have a brief moment for some questions.
So if anybody does have questions for our presenters, feel free to put them in the chat. I'm going to